Seen a set of videos, portraits of people speaking. Those are from the clinics. Those of you who haven't yet gone to the kiosk and talked to the people, the brave, the great people of the clinics, please do so. The rest of the day will proceed quite smoothly. There's one change. We will have a presentation by Mahreen Murtaza, which was scheduled for yesterday, which will come on to this afternoon before the conversation with Ashish Nandi. Everything else is as follows. Thanks. My pleasure to introduce Pablo Helguera, Edith Rogoff, and Molly Nesbitt. Where is Edith Rogoff? She'll appear.
Espacio a la pedagogía en este encuentro. La palabra educación está inextricablemente vinculada al futuro. Nos solemos referir a ella como la clave de una sociedad justa, libre y democrática. Al mismo tiempo, el discurso político de campaña se apropia de la noción de educación para emitir clichés como, entre comillas, construir a través del conocimiento un futuro mejor. Y el problema comienza ahí, cuando la educación queda relegada a aquella retórica del futuro, existiendo en un permanente limbo de no ser todavía lo que se espera y no existir en el presente más que como una promesa. Si bien el aspirar es seguramente necesario, lo menos deseable es existir en aquel estado permanente, nebuloso, de espera a Godot. En esta mesa hablaremos de estas pausas y suspensiones, de este espacio entre el presente y el futuro, de estos momentos esperanzados que generan estos ímpetus de educación y acción hacia el futuro y desde el pasado. En esta empresa aún nos influye el pensamiento de los años 60. Y en México, quizá el escritor de aquella generación que mejor expresó este instante de suspensión al que me refiero fue Salvador Elizondo, quien en su novela Farabef o la crónica de un instante escribe, cito: somos una premonición, la imagen que se forma en la mente de alguien mucho antes de que los acontecimientos mediante los cuales nosotros participamos en su vida tengan lugar. Un hecho fortuito que aún no se realiza, que apenas se está gestando en los resquicios del tiempo. Un hecho futuro que aún no acontece. Somos un signo incomprensible trazados sobre un vidrio empañado en una tarde de lluvia. Somos el recuerdo casi perdido de un hecho remoto. Con el fin de romper aquel estado de eterna suspensión, recurrimos a la pedagogía, pero no solo como el ímpetu utopista inspirador de un futuro posible e impalpable aún, sino como un proyecto que ocurre en el presente, a través de actos concretos y fehacientes que a su vez son la mejor garantía de la gestación de aquel mundo en el que vemos el futuro. En el 2008, en Estados Unidos, la retórica populista de Barack Obama, que fascinó el mundo, se afianzaba en el término hope, esperanza. Y es interesante reflexionar, en la perspectiva de solo hace 3 años, las enormes diferencias de deseo de un proyecto social anclado en la esperanza y aquel actualmente expresado a nivel global por Occupy Wall Street, que es nihilista por una parte y propositivo por otra. Visto de cualquier manera, nuestra relación con aquella idea de esperanza es mucho más problemática hoy, siendo reemplazada por escepticismo, decepción y a la vez urgencia por percibir cambios con efectos inmediatos. Un estado que se siente particularmente hoy en día en este año electoral 2012, aquí en México, en Estados Unidos, Francia, Rusia, Alemania y muchos otros países. En un momento determinado, las promesas huecas de cambio y transformación en países con inestabilidad económica y social llegan a su límite y provocan un quiebre, como ha sucedido con este evento definitorio de nuestro presente, la primavera árabe, un episodio que nos ha obligado a recalibrar o reafirmar lo que entendemos por posibilidad, ciberactivismo, autoorganización y de otras maneras en la actividad artística misma y su relación con la pedagogía. En el mundo del arte, estos eventos históricos hacen aún más urgente la resolución de una serie de debates que se han venido dando desde hace algunos años en lo tocante al arte de interacción social, a veces referido como arte relacional, de práctica social, etc., El debate en cuestión gira en torno al problema de uso-valor de estas prácticas artísticas en territorio de activismo o de cambio social. No puedo representar por límite de tiempo adecuadamente este debate aquí, pero mencionaré que algunos críticos como Claire Bishop, Grant Kester, Shannon Jackson y artistas como Liam Gillick han articulado diversas posturas en relación a la forma en que estas prácticas conciben o refuerzan el territorio artístico y cómo buscan actuar en el ámbito social. El arte que viene como respuesta de este arte relacional de los 90 busca, yo sugeriría, un tipo de interacción que no es exclusivamente determinada ya por el espacio del arte, el público del arte o incluso por el discurso artístico, que a veces tiene el deseo de romper con lo que podría ser una década de bienalización y el mercado global que la ha precedido. En este esquema, la pedagogía ocupa y continúa ocupando un lugar central en este debate. La pedagogía no solo ha sido central históricamente en formar comunidades de artistas, sino porque es intrínsecamente un proceso de interacción social en la que la experiencia no es el fin, sino el medio, ofreciendo un tipo de intercambio, al menos en teoría, más ambicioso y duradero que la interacción espontánea en un espacio de una galería. Los referentes del impulso pedagógico, o si se quiere decir del giro pedagógico de la última década, si bien responden al arte relacional, hacen también referencia a artistas como Alan Caprow y Joseph Beuys, para quienes la educación y el arte solían fusionarse, y particularmente en el caso de Beuys, asimismo el activismo. Regresando a este debate al que me refiero, la pregunta que surge es: ¿qué clase de modelos pedagógicos ofrece el arte educación para el futuro? ¿De qué forma debemos interpretarlos? Si solo como una poética de la pedagogía o como un posible esquema de acción activista. Las respuestas tienen implicaciones importantes en cómo desarrollaremos un lenguaje crítico para estas prácticas, pero sobre todo cómo el arte y su vertiente pedagógica se posicionan ante el momento social y político. En el caso de México sería probablemente necesario reflexionar acerca de nuestras muchas aventuras pedagógicas nacionales aún sin resolver, algunas que se han mencionado a lo largo de este simposio, y su intersección o desencuentro con el quehacer artístico. Sin duda, un personaje principal en esta historia ya mencionado es José Vasconcelos, quien mejor representa nuestras contradicciones entre este futurismo abstracto cultural del que hablaba y la acción activista concreta. El legado vasconcelista continúa siendo un profundo enredo teórico con el que no hemos lidiado por completo, como es el hecho de que aún repetimos: por mi raza hablará el espíritu, sin saber bien a bien exactamente qué significa tal declaración hoy. Otro ejemplo del legado del utopismo cultural y pedagógico aún se encuentra sin resolver en el zapatismo, cuyas propuestas continúan flotando como espectro en el discurso político de izquierda, y llegando a la actual suspensión en la que estamos, la lucha contra la violencia y el proyecto de artistas y escritores liderados por Javier Sicilia para influir y encontrar un rumbo de resolución. De manera que la otra pregunta de esta mesa es, no exclusivamente en términos de México, sino del arte global: ¿cómo el espíritu pedagógico, con su inherente futurismo y esperanza, se debe de posicionar hoy en día, teórica y prácticamente, en relación de estos eventos? ¿Qué repercusiones tiene el sacrificar el territorio autónomo del arte por el activismo? O sea, ¿dónde posicionamos a un arte que no quiere ser arte, sino pedagogía o activismo? Y en contraste, ¿cómo se valida una práctica meramente reflectiva o simbólica dentro de un mundo del arte que depende del 1%? Y finalmente, ¿qué es lo que estas prácticas nos revelan, nos dicen del futuro? ¿Cómo lo construyen? ¿Cómo lo predicen? ¿Cómo nos ayudan a prevenir que lleguemos a hacer algo más que esa permanente suspensión en espera de un futuro, una posibilidad fallida, o como dijo Elizondo, un recuerdo perdido de un hecho remoto? En esta mesa me acompañan Edith Rogoff y Molly Nesbitt. No repetiré las biografías ilustres que ambas tienen, puesto que ustedes las tienen en sus programas, pero quisiera enfatizar el papel crucial que ambas han jugado al construir los marcos del debate de estos temas. Molly como instigadora e interlocutora principal de proyectos como Utopia Station, Edith como voz central en los debates en torno al giro pedagógico en el arte. Les agradezco profundamente a ambas el estar aquí con nosotros y les voy a ceder la palabra para que luego procedamos a una conversación con ustedes. Gracias. Oye,
No, it's just images, and the first one's already there.
Do you have sounds?
No.
Just need this.
Oh, no sound. I have no sound either. So,
You need sounds?
so while all this is being organized, I would like to thank Shuddha and the organizers of SITAC for the invitation, for the pleasure of being in Mexico City, and of hearing all the voices that I've been hearing here for the past few days. I want to apologize a little bit for my images. I'm a very low-tech person and only rarely do sort of PowerPoint presentations. And I also have an extremely uneasy relationship to the concept of illustration. So both of these are evident in this not very sophisticated series of images. 2011. 2 countries, 2 protests, 2 tent universities, 2 questions, no answers. August, the tent occupation of the movement for social justice in Tel Aviv. The movement had started with a host of discontents over standards of living, pay, mortgages, real estate prices, food prices, etc. It was a response to the accelerated speed of capitalization of what had until recently been a welfare state. The deeper issues of the state, the occupation of Palestine, the extreme military presence in every facet of civil life, the foundational injustice of the premise of the Jewish state, seemed invisible in what was trying to be a popular movement about so-called social justice. And then a tent popped up on Rothschild Boulevard called 1948. And after that, one called the Nakba, and then another, and then another. And in these tents, a self-education project about the foundation of the state was unraveling. In a seminar in the 1948 tent, one participant says, "You've written a book about geography, about active processes of unbelonging. Can these, whatever they are," raising an eyebrow, "work to dismantle the occupation?" I am silent. November, the Bank of Ideas, part of the London Occupy movement, a seminar in a disused office of a financial company, UBS in this particular case, of a financial company in the city, the financial center of London, and in many eyes of Europe. The participants talk about agency and empowerment, and they want to know if the terms that I have turned up with, potentiality and singularization, are as effective. How exactly, they ask, do these terms affect the balance of power as we experience it? I am silent. This silence has not so much to do with the loss of words as with being confronted by a dilemma concerning the relation of critical terminology within the very exciting moment of taking action, or seeming to take action. The excitement of action, in the case of so many of the political revolutionary movements in Iran, Tunisia, Egypt, Bahrain, Yemen. I'm not speaking of Libya and Syria, as those seem to me to be more civil wars than protest movements, and of the social justice movements in Spain, Portugal, Greece, Israel, and of the ultra-capitalist Occupy movements in the United States, Canada, Britain, Italy, and elsewhere. The excitement seems to be that these are not just protest movements, but they're actually an effort to challenge and change the terminology which dominates political discourse. And such a challenge involves a huge project of self-education, of contesting the very knowledge base from which we know, of elaborating a self-generated pedagogy that privileges questions of what we need to know right now and how we need to know it, and whether this knowledge we so desperately need is analytical knowledge about the crisis, how it came about, who are its victims and who are its beneficiaries, what needs to be reformed, who needs to be made accountable? Or is there an emergent mode of crisis thinking that is coming about that is not descriptive and reactive, but generative? In particular, around the economy of crisis and the education of crisis, and at the intersection of critical economy, art, anthropology, and radical pedagogy. Instead of discussing the crisis itself, these become ways of framing and reframing critical issues, such as the one of insider and outsider, or individuals and collectives, or legitimacies and illegitimacies, through a performative process of cultural production. In particularly, crisis thinking looks at the idea of political contingency. What can we salvage in the debris of the crisis? Can we open new temporalities out of the here and now? In what ways have concepts of potentiality and of actualization replaced older notions of agency and of empowerment? Can short-term and informal economies and regimes of labor emerge from the financial and intellectual wasteland that surrounds us? The centrality of self-education platforms around the globe, and as part of all of these protest movements, have in effect produced one of these conjunctions that have been so difficult to predict or characterize. I have been part of the so-called recent educational turn in art for some 8 years now, through a series of exhibitions I curated and co-curated, a series of public forums and publications, but mostly through trying to theorize what I thought the implications of this educational turn were beyond a trope that privileged gatherings and conversations and self-generating seminars and reading groups as a form of artistic and cultural practice. One of the most interesting aspects of this turn has been the movement of ideas and critical thinking from the university out into the cultural sphere of the expanded field of art, and the invention of new platforms and new modes of dissemination for those ideas. Self-authorized night schools and free academies and reading groups and think tanks have recognized that we need to pose questions from many different places. That posed from elsewhere, the questions acquire a freedom they might not have had, that infiltrating institutions dedicated to one practice, the display of art, for example, with a series of active questions, changes that institution dramatically, and that we can't have one model of knowledge that fits all of our needs. What I'm showing here is a series of questions under the aegis of what can we learn from the museum beyond what the museum shows us, with which we walked, a group of 22 of us, into a museum in the Netherlands posing a series of questions that are sort of posed there. These platforms have been innovative and imaginative and have focused on questions rather than answers, on processes rather than products. When my collaborator Florian Schneider and members of his media activist group asked, and this is the image that I'm showing here, what does it mean to own an image? And this is part of a much larger project called Imaginary Property, which has largely to do with questions of copyright and of intellectual property. When they pose the question, what does it mean to own an image? They do far more than investigate the market and the ever-rising value of objects through systems of valorization. In thinking that it is not only the dealer who sold the piece. At the center of this image you see a design for a banner that was made by Lisitsky in 1921 and that was supposed to hang on the facade of the Art Academy in Vitebsk. And it was only through Marc Chagall denouncing Lisitsky to the authorities for some notion of perceived political misdemeanor that this actually never made it to the facade of the Vitebsk Art Academy, and recently the drawing for it entered the collection of the Van Abbe Museum in the Netherlands. So when the group asks what does it mean to own an image, they do far more than investigate the market and ever-rising value of objects through systems of valorization. In thinking that it is not only the dealer who sold the piece, the museum who bought it, the curator who will catalog and register it and display it, but also the restorer who conserved it, the truck driver who transported it, the student who studied it as part of their PhD dissertation, the writer who published a book about political banners and posters. All of these have an investment, partly capital, partly cultural, partly psychic, and driven by desire and by possession, and that these actually redefine the very notion of ownership. Put very briefly, as I look at the images that have come from Tahrir Square here and here, and Rothschild Boulevard, from Bank of Ideas and the 10th University, oops.
You're not so technically challenged as that, Julio.
Look at that, doesn't even have a title. Thank you. So put very briefly, as I look at the images that have come from Tahrir Square and Rothschild Boulevard, from Bank of Ideas and the 10th University, it would seem that this movement of ideas has continued from the research university, where some of them have been conceptualized, to the art world, where innovative new platforms have produced new accesses and audiences, to the realm of political protest, where people have insisted that to change conditions is to acquire new knowledge bases. We're speaking here today under the aegis of learning from the future. And I'm not sure about the future. I seem to so struggle with the present at every turn. And especially today, when the morning news began with the 7th day of direct shelling of Homs in Syria, and of a general strike in Egypt, and of endless civil unrest in Greece. And the promise of a year ago seems to be very delayed in fulfilling itself. So I seem to struggle with the present at every turn. Or because I think the future is always already there. As Gilles Deleuze famously said, every once in a while, the future rushes through the present like a gust of wind that disappears and leaves everything slightly disturbed within its stillness. I was listening to Keith Moxie speak about contemporaneity yesterday, and thought that for me, contemporaneity is never harnessed to a historical period, but it is rather a moment of interpellation, of being hailed by a problematic or an urgency, and of locating oneself within it, like Althusser's famous argument in his essay on ideological state apparatus. But unlike Althusser's location of interpellation as a form of internalized disciplining authority, this form of interpellation, this notion of interpellation, is the moment in which we make a problem our own. We are the problem, and it inhabits us, and we produce the terminology with which to see it anew. So self-education is not acting in a contemporary mode, a trope or a style, but is an instantiation of contemporaneity. My question here concerns the collective coming together that enacts this instantiation of contemporaneity. Jean-Luc Nancy, whose work has been incredibly important to me in the last 10 years in thinking about questions of participation and of collectivity and of what it means to take part in culture together. Jean-Luc Nancy proceeds to take on the proper names of collectivity, we and us, and their relation to meaning. And he does so obviously against the grain of the claims of identity and of their ability to separate and to segregate. He takes up the notion of meaning precisely because of this proliferation that has no other meaning than the indeterminate multiplication of centripetal meanings, meanings closed in on themselves and supersaturated with significance that are no longer meaningful because they refer to their own closure, to their horizon of appropriation, and have to spread nothing but destruction, hatred, and the denial of existence. To these ends, he has to go back to both we and meaning as the building blocks of another form of relatedness that is not founded on the articulation of identity. And these are a series of quotes from Nancy. We do not have meaning anymore because we ourselves are meaning, entirely without reserve, infinitely, with no more meaning other than us. Being itself is given to us as meaning. Being does not have meaning. Being itself, the phenomenon of being, is meaning, that is in turn its own circulation, and we are this circulation. There is no meaning then if meaning is not shared, and not because there would be an ultimate or first signification that all beings have in common, but because meaning is itself the sharing of being. So thinking back to the silence of those two moments in those two tents earlier this year, I begin to understand that this was not a learning and teaching situation. It was one of witnessing. What I have been observing is the constitution of the coming public, one that in the demise of the classical bourgeois public sphere, the demise of civil society public institutions under neoliberal governance, the increasing privatization of both urban spaces and sites of education, is constituting itself in the ebbs and flows of what Nancy calls being in common, and that the political potential of this mode of being in common has only begun to be explored. Thank you.
Brilliant. I too thank everybody, especially you, and there is a sequentiality to this, which was not, I have to tell you, it was not planned. Now, Sengupta, our great friend, called last fall about the future, which is not so different from calling about utopia. It was not so different from the call that came to me now, 10 years ago, from a Swiss friend of mine. Utopia, like the future, keeps coming up because it runs away. To chase it is to dream it. There are no direct paths. It seems to run in streams. We run alongside them. We rest on their banks. An imagery of riversides has nourished us. We are the tigers. None of this can be addressed as a purely general or abstract matter. The projects that we will keep discussing after our particular panel is finished. There are many of them small in scale, and if larger, mindful of their local base and point. It seems most important to be specific, particular, and to ask just what special effects and consequences we can note. What will we build? Those who have gone before us have left behind their experience for us to use, and for me, history is that experience. They've left their messages, their art, their books. For example, my main question really is this. It's pretty simple. How do books help us move forward, live forward? In general, the most helpful ones do not come forward as prophecies or monologues. They come when one writer invites another writer into his sentences to help finish them. So one writer invites another writer into his sentences to help finish them. For example, in the late spring of 1979, Roland Barthes had difficulty finding an end for the book he was calling Camera Lucida. Its subject, nominally, I think you all know it, was photography. And the manuscripts for this book show Barthes changing certain elements right up to the point when the last draft had to be sent off irrevocably to the printer. He'd labored over the punctum. He'd stalled at the end. Late in the game, he'd thought of a finish that would let his own thought just break off short, as if it had snapped. He would then have handed over the last words to Marpa, a Tibetan sage of the 11th century, a man known for bringing the Buddhist teachings from India northward. And these would be Marpa's words. Marpa was shaken when his son was killed, and one of his disciples said, "You have always told us that everything is illusion. And so, with the death of your son, is it not an illusion?" And Marpa replied, "Certainly. But, the death of my son is a super illusion." Now, in the end, Marpa's remark would be cut free from the book. Barthes didn't use it that way as the end. Instead, it's cut free and floated on the back cover uncommented, as if it too were an image or a cherry blossom branch. The last paragraphs of Camera Lucida show Barthes writing on alone, wrestling with the edges of reality and the kinds of form that can touch them. Form aspires, but can only aspire, he thought, to the condition of light. He was left alone with his questions. Was the photograph to be subjected to the civilizing force of the perfect illusion? Or would the photograph be allowed to rouse the dormant mind, to open its eyes to see, now, verily, the intractable reality? For another example, a few years later, I think it's 1982, a quotation from Racine hung on screen briefly as Chris Marker's new film, Sans Soleil, began. And the quotation is, l'éloignement des pays répare en quelque sorte la trop grande proximité des temps. Or in English, the distance between countries compensates somewhat for the excessive closeness of time. But in the English version, as the film Sunless, and its English title came forward, there was a different opening. A stanza from the poem Ash Wednesday by T.S. Eliot took the place. Because, and this is the stanza, I know that time is always time, and place is always and only place, and what is actual only for one time, and only for one place. And then, an image of three little girls walking through fields on a cold, bright day appeared. They walked uphill. A woman's voice began reading elegantly from a letter. The first image he told me about was of three children on a road in Iceland in 1965. He said that for him, it was the image of happiness, and also that he tried several times to link it to other images, but it never worked. He wrote me, one day I'll have to put it all alone at the beginning of a film with a long piece of black leader. If they don't see the happiness in the picture, at least they'll see the black. Words made to, stand apart, recounted as they are in Sans Soleil and in the Camera Lucida. Words suspended live differently. In these two cases, nothing is passed, only lit for an instant. Super illusions cannot have form or fire or sound in the usual sense of those words. They glide away, staring back. Night falls quickly over them. Chris Marker once said to me, keep me posted about utopia. He did. There's a story there, but later. For the third example, have to have three examples, especially when you're writing about the French. Jacques Rancière wrote Nights of the Proletariat, La Nuit des Prolétaires, a long, long book. At the same time that Marker sat sunless and about to put the pen toward his Camera Lucida. Nights of the Proletariat was published in 1981. Rancière chose to open his account at the gates of hell in the year 1841. The lives of French utopians, laborers by day and visionary political men and women by night, are documented individually as well as collectively as they head toward the great testing ground of 1848. Rancière took care not to speak for them, but to transport the real complexity of their thoughts and dreams forward. Dare one breathe the name of Scheherazade? Their nights become tales told by a philosopher. As Rancière set out his account of the Saint-Simonian visions of the 1830s, he wrote, "It is in the moments when the real world wavers and seems to reel into mere appearance, more than in the slow accumulation of day-to-day experiences, that it becomes possible to form a judgment about the world." The many utopian efforts to make judgments and give them political form would rely upon the existing conditions of metaphysics, but not mimic them. One worker, a joiner, wrote to another, a rag picker, "Plunge into terrible readings. They will awaken passions in your wretched existence, and the laborer needs them to stand tall in the face of that which is ready to devour him." So from the Imitation to Leila, these are books, explore the enigma of the mysterious and formidable chagrin at work in those with sublime concepts. Rancière follows their explorations. He recounts their words. Knowledge does not always appear as a quotation. It can be completely present and active when it is sublimely absorbed. My three French examples took their place in the decade after May of '68, when education itself was unmasked repeatedly as an ideological process, and organized knowledge itself was receiving an onslaught of reform and critique. We inherit that, actually. But education is really nothing more or less, I think, and I say this based on all my years in a classroom. Education is really nothing more or less than the signaling of the books that should make it through to the future. Whether through school or after school, it doesn't matter. Like the book entitled Utopia. Education involves the passage of wisdom, as well as certified training. Education is the stream alongside which books are passed from hand to hand. Books written by someone else, recommended, tested books. It is like the dynamic that Godard began to sketch in the months before the Black September of 1970 in Jordan, where Palestinian guerrillas discuss how to keep crossing a river without being killed. And they were killed. This is the film Ici et ailleurs. Afterward, the intervening river, the quick flow of current, became a structural image for Godard, a way of asking all the hard questions about communication, interruption, contact, discussion. Even with contact, there was no guarantee of parity or understanding, no crossing. And Gilles Deleuze, when he picked up this problem of the A, took it forward, first on the pages of the Cahiers du Cinéma, and then with Félix Guattari as they opened their Mille Plateaux. All this happened over 30 years ago. But hadn't Godard picked up the A from Sartre, who'd picked it up from The Sound and the Fury, a book by William Faulkner? When my Swiss friend Hans-Ulrich Obrist called about Utopia, we ended up with a project done with Réécriture à Venezia and called Utopia Station. When it took shape as an exhibition space in Venice, it offered a platform, like a quay, and a garden through which people, posters, art, conversations, some of you were part of it, about the conversations about the present and the future streamed. Leif Elgren and Michael van Hauswolf came and they pulped Utopia, the book, to make fresh sheets of paper for a new day. And someone else came along and hung unpulped pages, you see them on the line there, on their drying line, long after they had gone home to Sweden. Edward Glissant came and spoke. Yoko Ono set up a wish tree. We can never take all the books with us. We must choose to leave some behind, just as we choose to take some with us. The many collective art projects of the last 10 years have done as much. But so have the larger forums and movements, which have made every effort to keep the small-scale handoff of books going. Art, too, enters the rhythm of transfer and handoff there, sometimes invisibly. This is the Joseph Beuys corridor at the Mumbai World Social Forum in January 2004, which is an art space along with the Anna Mendieta Fabrik and the Nasreen Mohammadi lobby, spaces which opened up without a real sign of the forms of any of those artists, right, structuring the space. It was as if the forms were implicit, right, and carrying forth the exhibition. I show you the corridor. Joseph Beuys, of course, would have been inspiration on many counts, but let's just for the sake of the flow, signal his piece, I like America and America likes me, and the one with the coyote peeing on the Wall Street Journal. The new social movements of the 21st century, be they the small collectives or the World Social Forums or the occupiers spawned by the Occupy Wall Street, now have made books organize and open discussions, have asked writers and intellectuals to speak up, have made floating libraries an important part of their landscape, and have given both intellectuals and artists, this is the library in New York, this is the library bundled into its little house in the rain. Floating libraries are important in this landscape, and they've given both intellectuals and artists a challenge to use. Even Time magazine, which is not known for recognizing such things, has been obliged to acknowledge the presence of books in the issue which named the protester Person of the Year in 2011. Time, nostalgic for Marx and Engels' manifesto, seems to suggest a center or a static exhibition where there isn't really one. It can't reduce the movements of minds to a list. It can't summarize the shifting images of possible other worlds, the dreams that are visions, not mirage. It leaves out Hakim Bey and Gene Sharp and any number of books that have actually mattered to those living the Arab Spring and those who rally around the occupiers. It probably leaves out books that matter to you. How do the books travel from the preoccupation from preoccupation to preoccupation downstream to the future? Which ones would you take? Which ones would you give? This is the real site of theory now. Thinking is moving between people. It doesn't matter if there is or is not a school, so long as the thinking is being tested, inside and outside, so long as it is strong. Take this room, for example. Which book would you suggest that I take from you now? What would our library today here in this room be? And why these things and not others? These are questions we can answer and with which we can clear a short path, a tractable reality. Such paths are the ones that enable something, if not us, to survive time, at least for a while. A book could carry a wish. Knowledge does not always appear as a quotation. It can be completely present and active when it is sublimely absorbed. My three French examples took their place in the decade after May of '68, when education itself was unmasked repeatedly as an ideological process, and organized knowledge itself was receiving an onslaught of reform and critique. We inherit that, actually. But education is really nothing more or less, I think, and I say this based on all my years in a classroom. Education is really nothing more or less than the signaling of the books that should make it through to the future. Whether through school or after school, it doesn't matter. Like the book entitled Utopia. Education involves the passage of wisdom as well as certified training. Education is the stream alongside which books are passed from hand to hand. Books written by someone else, recommended, tested books. It is like the dynamic that Godot began to sketch in the months before the Black September of 1970 in Jordan, where Palestinian guerrillas discuss how to keep crossing a river without being killed. And they were killed. This is the film Ici et ailleurs. Afterward, the intervening river, the quick flow of current, became a structural image for Godot, a way of asking all the hard questions about communication, interruption, contact, discussion, Even with contact, there was no guarantee of parity or understanding, no crossing. And Gilles Deleuze, when he picked up this problem of the A, took it forward, first on the pages of the Cahiers du Cinéma, and then with Félix Guattari as they opened their Mille Plateaux. All this happened over 30 years ago. But hadn't Godard picked up the A from Sartre, who'd picked it up from The Sound and the Fury, a book by William Faulkner? When my Swiss friend Hans Ulrich Obrist called about utopia, we ended up with a project done with Recreatura Venezia and called Utopia Station. When it took shape as an exhibition space in Venice, it offered a platform, like a K, and a garden through which people, posters, art, conversations, some of you were part of it, about the conversations about the present and the future streamed. Leif Elgren and Michael van Hauswolf came and they pulped Utopia, the book, to make fresh sheets of paper for a new day. And someone else came along and hung unpulped pages, you see them on the line there, on their drying line, long after they had gone home to Sweden. Edward Glissant came and spoke. Yoko Ono set up a wish tree. We can never take all the books with us. We must choose to leave some behind, just as we choose to take some with us. The many collective art projects of the last 10 years have done as much. But so have the larger forums and movements, which have made every effort to keep the small-scale handoff of books going. Art, too, enters the rhythm of transfer and handoff there, sometimes invisibly. This is the Joseph Beuys corridor at the Mumbai World Social Forum in January 2004, which is an art space along with the Ahmadiyyat Fabrik and the Nasreen Mohammadi lobby, spaces which opened up without a real sign of the forms of any of those artists, right, structuring the space. It was as if the forms were implicit, right, and carrying forth the exhibition. I show you the corridor. Joseph Beuys, of course, would have been inspiration on many counts, but let's just, for the sake of the flow, signal his piece, I Like America and America Likes Me, and the one with the coyote peeing on the Wall Street Journal. The new social movements of the 21st century, be they the small collectives or the World Social Forums or the occupiers spawned by the Occupy Wall Street, now have made books organize and open discussions, have asked writers and intellectuals to speak up, have made floating libraries an important part of their landscape, and have given both intellectuals and artists. This is the library in New York. This is the library bundled into its little house in the rain. Floating libraries are important in this landscape, and they've given both intellectuals and artists a challenge to use. Even Time magazine, which is not known for recognizing such things, has been obliged to acknowledge the presence of books in the issue which named the protester Person of the Year in 2011. Time, nostalgic for Marx and Engels' manifesto, seems to suggest a center or a static exhibition where there isn't really one. It can't reduce the movements of minds to a list. It can't summarize the shifting images of possible other worlds, the dreams that are visions, not mirage. It leaves out Hakim Bey and Gene Sharp and any number of books that have actually mattered to those living the Arab Spring and those who rally around the occupiers. It probably leaves out books that matter to you. How do the books travel from the preoccupation from preoccupation to preoccupation downstream to the future? Which ones would you take? Which ones would you give? This is the real site of theory now. Thinking is moving between people. It doesn't matter if there is or is not a school, so long as the thinking is being tested, inside and outside, so long as it is strong. Take this room, for example. Which book would you suggest that I take from you now? What would our library today here in this room be? And why these things and not others? These are questions we can answer and with which we can clear a short path, a tractable reality. Such paths are the ones that enable something, if not us, to survive time. At least for a while. A book could carry a wish, like the cards Yoko Ono made for Occupy Wall Street to use, with the idea that trees will multiply to hold them, and wishes grow. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you so much for your wonderful presentations. We don't have much time, so I will pose a question for you two first. Then maybe we can proceed with the questions that you have posed to the audience.
Okay.
But I first want to mention that I was very interested in how both of you speak about the process of education as something like the need of constructing a yet unanswered question. Essentially rediscovering our own role within the public realm and then constructing our own collectivity, our own structures of knowledge. And I do want to point out that also you do teach in a public institution, and the question remains, so what are we supposed to do with those public institutions?
What institution?
What do we do with public institutions that teach? What is to be done with them? And for that reason, and because there's a lot of students in SITAC, and I want to acknowledge their presence, I want to read a letter from a 20-year-old student that he wrote to my wife, who is Danielle Tegader, who teaches art at Lehman College in the Bronx. A very bright student and a really interesting person, Jorge Luis Javier. He's 20 years old. And he decided to drop out of art school and join Occupy. So he wrote to her, "Dear Danielle, I've decided I'm finished with school. As I hope you may have gathered from our conversations of late, this was not something I took lightly. I've struggled and agonized and lost many hours of sleep over the last several months because of this. But ultimately, I decided this is right for me at this time. From the larger pseudo-political metaphysical perspective, the reason I dropped out of school is because I reject a higher education system that standardizes expectations regardless of individuality and diminishes the vastness of human capacity to credit hours and letter grades. No matter how hard I tried, I could not reconcile the fact that in our society, individuals are validated by a degree system that not everyone has access to. The culture that determines human capabilities by arbitrary, and in many cases irrelevant, grade point averages is fatally flawed. In protest of this system and in camaraderie with all of my brethren with whom higher education is not a possibility, I decided I'm finished. Also during these revolutionary times, when so many of my fellow young people are putting it all on the line, I'm least willing to give this up. This is not to say that I do not value education. The 4 years I have spent at Lehman have been the formative ones of my life. But the point is that led to my decision was the artistic path I have found myself on. Rather than going to class and doing homework, I need my time to meet with artists, exchange with people, search for inspiration, and make my art. The truth is, I no longer have time for school. After all, if school is to help one to find his purpose, I have already found mine, and so I no longer need it. Talk soon, with utmost respect, Jorge Luis Javier. P.S. Can we be Facebook friends now? So, I suspect, and I think, he's not alone, nor is it just a situation of a student in the Bronx, but I think it's true of many places around the world. I wonder, what would you say to him?
Do you want to start? Because you actually teach artists, and I teach a different kind of... You don't? This is for what? All right, I'll start. It seems to me that the years in which one spends in school have something to do with certification and getting a degree, and that the degree can have a practical benefit for things like getting a regular job, what we used to call a regular job, but that if we're really talking about the life of the mind and the, one's sort of movement, towards, broadening, sharpening, and increasing one's ability to grasp the world in which one is moving, that education can happen in many different ways. Schools happen to be a pretty efficient way of getting a lot of sort of knowledge to you in a synthetic form that's been summarized and mapped by someone who can be your guide. But your guide is not going to replace your own work of synthesizing, moving forward, and making your own maps. It's just, school is like a tool. And so if you pick up the tool and it helps, that's great. It's even better if it's free. In the United States, mostly it's not free, which is another, weight, I think probably in your student's letter. But it's not the only place where, thinking goes on. And so why not leave and push forward? I don't think it's very complicated, finally.
Go for it.
Yeah, who needs a PhD? It's been useful to me, but it's not the only way to go. I'd say the same thing about an MFA, and the PhDs that are being put forward for artists now. I think it's an interesting phenomenon. I don't fully understand why it's necessary, but that's another debate. I think we need to think a little bit about how we're going to direct this. I mean, do we want to talk about the practical books? What do we want to talk about?
Well, first of all, do you have anything to say?
I suppose I wouldn't want to enter a notion of prioritization, in terms of learning. What is a priority? Because I don't think that formal education is a preparation, in the sense that I don't think that there is a curriculum that prepares us to deal with things, and at a certain moment we can say, that's it. Now we're ready. We can really sort of enter the fray. And so I think of the kind of educational formats that I've been able to develop as sort of moments of coming together in which we actually produce the subject and we produce the curriculum. But more than anything else, and I've had the luck to be, I suppose, the luck to be in a slightly shabby institution, which I realize every year is a greater and greater fortune. So it won, because of its essential shabbiness, doesn't really have very much to preserve or protect, and it allows us to do things that other kinds of institutions might not. And so we've been able to start a series of programs, and I realized at a certain point that really these programs were about who would come, that we would float a platform without a curriculum, not really knowing full well what we would teach, knowing that this was a field that required some kind of an intellectual political intervention, but waiting to see who turned up in order to see, what it would become. So my sense is that education is that moment. It's that moment of a lot of people suddenly recognizing themselves in the description of a possibility and then coming together and instantiating contemporaneity, what I was trying to talk about, recognizing that perhaps we share part of an urgency, perhaps we can enact that moment of contemporaneity by sort of in a way saying, this is our collective sort of toolkit. The books that we read, the films that we saw. But what do we do to take them and make and actualize them in the present? And so I think that that's what education sort of at its best does. It takes several toolkits, it actualizes them and makes them face the present, and it brings together unexpected conjunction of people because it floats a platform of possibility that they just might recognize themselves in for a moment. One of the things that's really interesting is that I never mind when people sort of leave the program halfway through. The university minds terribly because of fees and because of records and continuity. But I think actually the really important moment was the moment they recognized the program and came. Mm-hmm. And what happened afterwards is not so important.
You know, what I think, yeah, go ahead.
I just want to say one thing. When, we self-educate, I think that it's important to keep in mind, and I speak to you now as a pragmatist from the John Dewey zone, that I'm not going to say that the idea needs to become practical or material, but what I'm going to talk about is expertise and the difference between expertise and authority, because one does go to school to learn something from somebody else who has a kind of experience that you don't have and I don't have. And so, for example, one of the great experiences for me in Utopia Station was meeting Emanuel Wallerstein, who is an intellectual with, boots on the ground political experience that goes for decades. And his way of being able to mobilize an idea, standing up and talking to a group of people who do and don't have, his expertise or even share his ideas or know they share his ideas before he starts speaking, was revelatory to me because there were techniques there's kinds of expertise that come with rhetoric, with teaching, techniques, with the kind of language you can use and the way you can put an abstract idea forward and twist it to make it vivid for someone else and useful for someone else. And then they're just the plain, much more, sort of technical twists and turns and nuances in a philosophical argument or in a set of scientific techniques. And education is, it does involve that kind of thing. One is lifted by an education, not only inspired. And, we need that kind of knowledge to be in play as well.
One of the things good, thank you. One of the things that were underlying my question had to do with not so much, it had to do with structured knowledge versus self-initiated knowledge, but it also has to do with the knowledge that one gains from art. And the thing is that the constant debates that I constantly encounter, specifically with artists who are engaging in socially engaged work, is that they don't feel experts of anything. And they feel like, why would I should make something within the realm of art if what I want to do is activism? What is there for me to be an expert of? Shouldn't I become an activist? And the question is, what is it? How can we articulate what is to be learned from existing in the art realm? How do you characterize the expertise that learning from art gives you?
Well, and I would say I'm thinking about the panel that we had yesterday with 3 artists, among whom was Trevor Padman and Julio Aranda, and the sort of immense pleasure that I found in this kind of bumbling, kind of amateurish moving around fields that are really owned by experts, and the incredible set of permissions that became apparent, that you could start from somewhere else and you could form your questions differently and you didn't have to have a kind of huge basis of knowledge in order actually to enter the sort of possibilities that these particular kind of astrophysics and the archaeology of warfare and the study of lines of longitude might have insisted on in some other mode. So I think that there is, and as a result, to produce absolutely oblique lines of knowledge into these fields. So I myself find the replacement of expertise, which is frontal and recognizes a whole teleology of a body of knowledge, with oblique angles of entering things and then producing knowledge as partly factual and partly affective. And I think that is an immense contribution that sort of creative practices have made to ways of knowing, entry points into knowledge, the lightening the incredible burden of scholasticism that we've inherited. So in those senses, I think that this is actually an incredibly interesting research model.
Yeah. Vamos a tomar dos preguntas del público, puesto que no tenemos mucho tiempo. Aquí, adelante.
Hola. Retomando pues lo que tú dijiste de activismo con el arte. ¿No se oye bien? ¿Ya?
Un poco más fuerte.
¿Ya? ¿Ya está? Ok. Parece ser que este simposio está ocurriendo en sí en una realidad muy desfasada. Las mismas personas son al final las que viven este tipo de eventos. Pero, ¿qué pasa con las otras realidades circundantes? Realidades que además constituyen la mayor parte de la población y que nosotros como snobs desechamos automáticamente de nuestro mundo del arte. ¿Cómo insertar esta parte de la sociedad rezagada sin mostrarle necesariamente patrones rígidos y cómo a través del arte esto puede ocurrir? Y cabe mencionar que esta sociedad o esta parte de la sociedad no quiere tener nada que ver con el arte, que es una realidad, por lo menos en México, de lo que vivimos. Igual en la Ciudad de México no tanto, pero yo personalmente soy de Michoacán y hay mucha gente que le interesan las prioridades básicas para vivir y no todo lo demás.
I think that I would move away from languages of inclusion and exclusion, because I don't think it's any longer about bringing people in. Do I have 1 minute for an anecdote? We had a visit by a very famous Dutch museum director, and he did the usual museum director talk, and then at a certain point he said, we have such a problem at the museum trying to bring the Surinamese community of Rotterdam into this famous old museum. And he went on and on and on about all the strategies of bringing in, those who are excluded and so on. And we got more embarrassed and more uncomfortable as he went on. And none of us really knew, he's a good guy in general, didn't want to insult him. And none of us really knew what to do. And then one of our students raised his hand and said, "Excuse me, they're already there. They wash your floors, they take out your garbage, they wash the dishes in the kitchen, they deliver the post, they fix the electricity, you just don't see them." And so the sort of the notion that one has to have, these kind of conveyance moment from an outside to an inside, I think is one we don't really want to operate with. Because one of the things that I was maybe trying to talk about is that I think the art world, and this is something I take real pleasure in, because most of the time I have a very bad opinion of the art world. I think the art world has produced really innovative platforms for sharing information and knowledge, and that those have moved unacknowledged. I think people doing sort of sit-ins and producing little readers and having seminars, they don't think that their platforms have come from some museum, somewhere in the Netherlands. It's not important. The platforms migrate absolutely independently of their sources. And I think that what we have, and this is where new technologies have come in, we have an incredibly accelerated movement of new modes of engagement and practice. And they're unacknowledged, and they should be unacknowledged. They're simply sort of platforms that can be moved around from one place to the other and taken up and done things with that have nothing to do with their original intention. So I think that I would ask that question, but I would rephrase it. I wouldn't talk about bringing those who are outside in. I think everything's gone outside and is sort of circulating and moving in incredibly interesting ways.
Well, I'll say two words, Immanuel Wallerstein, because part of it is rhetoric. How do you talk to somebody who's not like you, doesn't think like you, and why should, what we do be of interest to anybody else? Maybe it doesn't have to be, that there, anyway, so that would be one thing. But the way in which I think one does, engage or exchange ideas with someone else is to talk to them, be with them. It's in a funny way, it's not very complicated, but it has to be informal, not formal. So it's a question of rhetoric and a question of informality, because if you have a formal setup, and even an exhibition is almost always too formal as a place for real exchange. You have to dynamite it somehow to get people to experience, or sort of open up their experiences to your experiences, especially if they're not your friends. So it's, frankly, all of this it's just life, it's not new. And it's something, and I think also the other thing to say, maybe to be quick about this, is that the small scale is the way to work. To produce this kind of informality. You can't really do it in a mass way.
Or like with an organization like UNESCO.
For example, or, but little UNESCO. The World Social Forums were very good at this, actually.
Yeah, they were.
Bueno, es que había una pregunta ahí atrás. No, es que es en... bueno.
I see two.
¿Se oye? No se escucha, ¿no? ¿Sí? ¿Sí? Se escucha. Acá, de este lado, quisiera hacer, primero, digamos, como agradecer la riqueza de elementos desde las dos perspectivas en la que han analizado modelos educativos, estrategias y formatos de intercambio, y además el énfasis en el presente y en la urgencia. Desde el punto de vista de las clínicas, que han sido espacios de encuentro en corto en este SITAC, se han generado una serie de diálogos y entre otros temas se han abordado, digamos, las estructuras jerárquicas para entre comillas, construcción del conocimiento y las problemáticas de articular distintos momentos de diálogo y etcétera, ¿no? Ya que estamos, por otro lado, a lo largo de estos 3 días se han abordado también distintas temporalidades y nociones de presente, futuro, de recuperar una memoria previa, etcétera. Y quisiera apelar a 2 puntos que creo que han sido enfatizados en sus 2 presentaciones. Una de ellas, el presente, y la otra, el análisis de los formatos de intercambio y perdón. En ese sentido, lo que quisiera es proponer un ejercicio y pedirles que se hicieran un análisis del aquí y el ahora en el que estamos, de este teatro, esta arquitectura, el formato del panel, el diálogo y lo que han encontrado en su experiencia, cuál sería, digamos, el aporte o la acción o la agencia quizá pedagógica de un modelo como este en el momento en el que estamos.
Pablo, I think you should start.
I'll start. I'll start. Because I'm right now teaching Dan Graham. And Dan Graham had a great piece called Performance Audience Mirror, which involved describing like this. And I'm not going to imitate, Dan's inimitable. But I think the formal auditorium where you see us, but we see you in the half light. This is kind of a known setup. And but what I can say from my experience as a teacher is that I will see this very differently because I'm an art historian. So I'm used to teaching in the dark or speaking in the dark. It doesn't bother me at all. That kind of lights me up. I don't like speaking, when all the lights are on. It's, too brutal. I can't meditate, it's like that. But I think the way in which these big auditoria can be animated is changing because the entertainment culture is changing and everybody feels their own individuality more. And so I think in general when anybody listens to talks, there's a kind of passivity involved because you have to listen while we speak. And then the question becomes, how do we reactivate, so that you speak back, we speak back, and so on. And that is generally a function of time, which, as you know, we don't have enough of. But I think if we had another hour, that the roles would shift, the lights would go up, we would mess things up quite a lot, and, it would be fairly simple to do it. But, of course, we're on the long march to the end of the day, and I don't know that it's going to be allowed. Not to, be disruptive or anything. I'm just saying that.
Say something.
Go.
Say something. Should I say in Spanish? Yeah. Yo constantemente me he preocupado por el tema del aprendizaje y el formato. Y siempre, de hecho, he sido un crítico muy acervo de este formato arquitectónico. Creo que hay ya bastantes estudios que comprueban que la conferencia es el peor método de comunicación. Es decir, es la peor manera de realmente explicar un tema y de entenderlo para un público. Y esto es por la pasividad que genera, ¿no? Y claro, y que no está en sincronía con este mundo que describe Molly, efectivamente, ¿no? En ciertas situaciones, desgraciadamente, tenemos que conformarnos con lo que tenemos, ¿no? Nosotros llegamos y entramos a este formato. No es que nosotros quisiéramos hacerlo así necesariamente. Puedo imaginarlo mucho más activo, definitivamente. Sin embargo, también es verdad que hay mucha gente que no le gusta el diálogo de la misma manera. La gente, porque el aprendizaje ocurre de diferentes maneras, en diferentes manifestaciones. Hay personas que prefieren leer, hay personas que prefieren tener una conversación, hay personas que quieren ver un video. De manera que uno también tiene que entender que la educación, el formato educativo nunca puede ser uniforme, sino que tiene que ser diversificado de acuerdo a lo diversificado del público, ¿no? Y por eso es que la educación, por ejemplo, en museos tiene que diversificarse, siendo conversación, siendo debate, siendo texto, siendo interacción en línea, etc. Porque es multigeneracional y multiinterés, ¿no? Pero bueno,
just to add one thing, I think maybe we need a broader range of understandings of what it is to be active as an audience. And I think for me, what's become really important is a model that came out of the study of literature in the 1980s, which is the notion of the address. And it's actually became important to me through a very long period of work with an artist called Kutluk Ataman, a Turkish film and video artist. And I think one of the things I learned from the kind of 6 years of work that we did together was this notion of the address, in which you begin by a recognition that what you are saying is understood. Right, that the sort of the people that you are addressing, whoever it is you're addressing, actually have the ability to recognize the voice, and that it's not particularly sort of imprisoned within a set of local bodies. And I don't mean that, but that the opposite of that is universal transcendence. I mean that what the opposite of that is sort of a mode of speech which operates through a contract that I can hear you and you can hear me, and all of the work that goes into that. But it means that you're not working contextually, you're not thinking of activating people, you're thinking about the fact that whatever you say, it always meets in the center through a particular mode of understanding that then activates it in another way. So I find that the sort of thinking not about telling people things, but of having a certain kind of contract with them, where, you know, it's like a newspaper, a paper airplane that you send out that halfway through kind of collapses and falls on the floor, never reaches any destination. It seems to me that that's what happens when you sort of speak in public. You send something, Derrida says it's a send-off, you send something off. You don't ensure its arrival, you don't have a particular kind of destiny for it, but you send something off, and in that gesture, you produce an address, you produce a contract with whoever it is that you're speaking with.
I like to just say one thing in defense of lecturing.
Of lectures?
Yeah, because I think if you think about it, if Michel Foucault were sitting at this table and he wanted to speak for 2 hours, none of us would mind at all. And lecturing has a lot to do with address, as you say, a lot to do with address, but it also has to do with the expectation, I think, on the part of the audience for a certain kind of engagement. And most classrooms are activated in that way through note-taking, because the notes become your way of processing, entering, and answering the speaking with writing. And there's a kind of real exchange of minds going on as the hand writes or types, But that rewriting, right, the entering of somebody else's voice, right, on the page of your writing, that's the transfer. And it's very magnetic when it's done well. But of course, it depends on the lecture really carrying thoughts that need to be parsed and, brooded over and understood. And real education happens, at that high level, and it requires a lot of delay. And the notes are the way in which you carry these ideas you don't understand yet, but they're written down forward so that the idea can dawn on you later. And, that...
But Malin, isn't that, I'm sorry.
No, that's
But isn't that the same as the reader and the writer, the same action of the reader?
Yeah.
So, and
but it can happen in real time too.
But then what is it? So why is it better to hear it live?
Because there is I'll steal some thunder from you, Reed. The being of the person is carrying the knowledge, and when knowledge passes from person to person, it stays live in a way that it doesn't always as it's passed textually.
Nos piden que terminemos, pero bueno, había una persona que había pedido una pregunta que siento que tenemos que respetar.
Hola, yo quería hacer un par de puntos, quería mencionar un par de cosas que bueno, me parecen un tanto sospechosas por parte de la señorita del lado derecho, que yo acabo de llegar, no sé su nombre. Una es la insistencia sobre los procesos literarios y la validación de los mismos a través de la historia dentro del contexto diacrónico de sí misma, ¿no? O sea, de qué manera concebir a lo que ya está instalado como una figura hegemónica de la literatura, como una posibilidad de la educación. A mí me parece que en ese sentido, la figura de Rancière, por ejemplo, el maestro ignorante, podría ser una posibilidad para entender que la hegemonía en sí está instalada como una figura de Estado, en donde esta figura de Estado otorga la identidad a la cultura para volverse hegemónica y en sí convertirse en tal. Eso en el caso de la insistencia con la literatura y con cómo el diacronismo mismo de la historia se instala en la contemporaneidad y nos podría dar un poco la respuesta de la compañera que había mencionado de Michoacán, los procesos que podrían ser un poco más ampliados hacia no la validación y no la inclusión, sino justamente el disenso frente a la educación. Eso por una parte. Por otra parte, me parece bastante interesante del lado izquierdo que se haya mencionado el concepto de urgencia, aunque me parece que justamente el concepto de urgencia más o menos
ya no tenemos.
Era...
Vamos a dejar que Molly y Irit te respondan.
Well, I can be pretty brief, actually, because just because the state has given you a curriculum doesn't mean that everything contained in the curriculum is going to be poisoned with a state power. I think part of the reality of education does involve standardized curricula. And, over the past few centuries, as state education has undergone its transformations and, it's been given its logics, the, knowledge had been bent through those channels. That doesn't mean that one can't do other things with the knowledge, and that an awareness of the apparatus through which you are threaded does give you some power to, think differently about how to use what you've been given, and also to look at the choices you haven't been given. You go looking for them, to sort of figure out the drama of the logic, right? That, you've been handed. So it's, I think that's, and the other thing I would say is that I'd go back to my point about distinguishing between expertise and authority. It is not always such a bad thing to submit to a discipline, but one needs to understand it, right, as one is submitting. And then one gets strong enough to emerge from it and do what one wants to with the result. But knowledge does come with, this is not something you can say quickly. It's not just a kind of free and easy expansion of ideas. Knowledge has its own limits and forces and rules. Yeah. And, to think the big thoughts and to extend, right, and, create new concepts or create new forms, because it doesn't all happen, as we know, verbally. It takes time and inspiration, but it also takes what the jazz musician might call chops, And
I'll just continue what Molly was saying. Knowledge doesn't come easily, and it doesn't come easily because you cannot learn something new until you unlearn something old. And so the process is it's a constant process of unlearning, because knowledge is not additional information. It's kind of processes of thought. And those processes of thought are largely processes of unlearning. And so I don't think that, let's say, the classroom is a really, hegemonic sort of structure of submission, because I think what takes place in it all the time are kind of very dynamic processes of unlearning, whose kind of, the end of whose development I don't really see, because it happens in the kitchen of the students in a discussion that they're having between them, and all you've done is really the send-off. What I was, quoting Derrida as the send-off of unlearning. So I think that it is a much less binary, much more dynamic process, and most of it is about sort of discarding certain things, to produce the possibility of thinking something new or something different. The other thing I want to say is I would really disagree with you about the notion of emergency and urgency, because I think emergency is statecraft. I think emergency is the language of the state that produces fearful subjects, whether they're fearful of drought or of pollution or of warfare or of the terroristic. I think that emergency is absolutely the language of statecraft, and urgency is one of the few things that we have at our disposal to counter that. It's the moment in which you make a problematic your own, that you're somehow imbricated in it. Okay.
Muchas gracias. Disculpen la extensión. Gracias.